Thank you all for being here tonight. My name is Blake Kimsey, and I'm the executive director of writingworkshops.com, and it's my pleasure to introduce James Tate Hill and his agent and fellow author Eric Smith tonight. Now, I first came to know JT on Twitter. Maybe a lot of you know JT on Twitter, you know Eric on Twitter. JT's funny, he's endlessly encouraging, and he's just one of the most generous members of the literary community, as you'll hear tonight, just as he shares his journey to publication, as he gets to talk with Eric. And he's just a gifted writer. Some of you have already ordered and are reading Blind Man's Bluff, or you've read his columns at LitHub or elsewhere. So I'm really excited about the conversation tonight. And I also feel really lucky that we have JT on staff here at writingworkshops.com teaching both fiction and nonfiction classes. And tonight we're really just here to celebrate the publication of JT's debut memoir, which received high praise in the New York Times yesterday. Congratulations, JT.
Thank you.
But if you don't know, Blind Man's Bluff is JT's humorous and often heartbreaking tale of losing his sight and how he hid it from friends, colleagues, and lovers for about 15 years. He even convinced himself that if he stared long enough, his blurry peripheral vision would bring the world into focus. And at 30, faced with a stalled writing career, a crumbling marriage, and a growing fear of leaving his apartment, he began to wonder if there was a better way. So tonight, in addition to the book's themes of disability and self-acceptance, we'll also hear JT and Eric talk candidly about the writing process, the road to publication, and the author-agent relationship. And tonight we'll conclude with a Q&A. So if you have any questions as they're talking, just put those into the chat and we'll get to them later, or you can hold on to them and ask them at the end, at the conclusion. So without further ado, let me formally introduce our guests. James Tate Hill is the author of Blind Man's Bluff, published today by W.W. Norton. His fiction debut won the Nilsen Literary Prize for a novel. His essays were notable in the 2019 and 2020 editions of Best American Essays. He serves as fiction editor for Monkeybicycle and does a great job. I love reading the stuff you publish, JT. And he's a contributing editor for Literary Hub, where he writes a monthly audiobooks column. And JT was born in Charleston, West Virginia, and he lives in North Carolina with his wife. And I'm thrilled to have Eric Smith here tonight. Eric is he's a literary, and he lives in Philadelphia. As a writer, his latest novel is Don't Read the Comments, published in January of 2020. And that was a 2021 Best Fiction for Young Adults selection, and the paperback is now out. Eric's upcoming book is You Can Go Your Own Way, which publishes this fall, November 2nd, and is available for pre-order. And he's also put together a cool anthology co-edited with Lauren Gibaldi called Battle of the Bands that publishes September 14th. So these are two very talented writers. They have a unique relationship as author-agent, and it's my great pleasure to present to you James Tate Hill and Eric Smith. So thank you both very much for being here tonight, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to hang out and chat. It's fun. Just want to apologize to the audience in advance. I'm in my shed in my backyard, and my solar batteries are at like 15%. I think we're gonna be good. But if I disappear, I will probably reappear somewhere in my house shortly after.
I'll sing TV theme songs until you return if you happen to disappear.
Yeah, but this is awesome, James. Congrats. I'm so excited that the book is out today. It was such a joy getting to work on this memoir with you. And yeah, I'm excited to talk about the process of how we got here today.
Yeah. I'm going to, as I did in our agent-author relationship, let you lead the way, and I'm happy to go wherever you want to go.
Awesome. No, it's my pleasure. So the really wonderful way that James appeared in my inbox was via an introduction from our mutual friend and one of my clients, Allison Stein. She wrote the book Road Out of Winter, which won the Philip K. Dick Award this year, and happens to be a mutual friend of James's. So one day I get this email, said, Eric, I know this writer, he's really talented, he's really wonderful, he's written this memoir, I think you might like it. Would it be weird if I CC'd you in to chat with him? Well, no, of course not. Let me, introduce him. Let's see. So we get a quick little email exchange. And then James formally sends me his query letter. And that's the important thing I want to touch on there, because I don't want to give the impression that it's an industry where it's, oh, well, James was introduced by somebody, so it's all about who you know, et cetera, et cetera. It still had to be a good book and an interesting query letter. And the query letter that James sent me, James, would you mind if I shared some
Go
of it?
for it, yeah.
Yeah. So his query letter said, Dear Eric, at age 30, facing a crumbling marriage, a stalled writing career, and a growing fear of going outside, I wondered if lying about who I was for the last 15 years might be the cause of my problems. A routine trip to the eye doctor when I was 16 led to a diagnosis of incurable blindness. I can no longer read, but I'd never been much of a reader. I couldn't drive, but lots of people don't drive. Such was the logic that allowed me, along with some fuzzy peripheral vision, to continue passing for sighted. And I remember getting to that line in the query letter and being like, oh my God, there's no way that this is what the memoir is about. And he says, from a trip to Tokyo for experimental treatment, to the terror of literal blind dating, to the publication of a novel with a blind narrator, Blind Man's Bluff charts a winding, often humorous path from denial to acceptance. Portions of the manuscript have appeared in, and he lists all the places that he's been published, and then talks about himself. He talks about all the places that he's edits for, the places his short stories have been published, and then dishes some comp titles. But the shocking thing that he does here is really tells us a lot about what's at stake for him as a person, who's hiding this condition, and sort of the character arc that we're going to experience here from, as a kid going to get treatment, to being an author, to literally blind dating. He did all these things so wildly right in the query letter to show me what the stakes were going to be for our narrator, for him in the book. So even if it wasn't an email that was introduced to me by a mutual friend, this is something I would have ran screaming to request right away, because it sounded so good, and I feel like your query letter was just a really masterful kickoff to our relationship here, which is great.
And excuse me, and it's not to say that query was that way when I started writing the query. It evolved over time after rejections, and as did the memoir quite a bit. And one of the things that I think is insightful is if you heard Blake's introduction, like one of those lines or two sounds kind of like lines in the query letter. And lo and behold, the jacket copy, quite often, I'm sure you've known this to happen with your own work and tons of clients' work, where if you polish that query enough, parts of it will probably end up in the marketing copy.
It happens all the time. You'll see the jacket copy of a book, and sometimes there's pieces of the query letter tucked away in there. So you queried me this book, and I feel like things happened really fast, right? Didn't I request it and read it really quick?
Yeah. I think your initial response was, go ahead and send me a proposal. And I'm like, oh, I don't have a proposal, but here's the whole book that's been finished for some time if you want to see that. And you were like, okay, yeah, let's read. And go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that's an interesting aside here for anyone who's listening in from the writers' workshops that is maybe thinking about writing a memoir, or kicking around a memoir, that usually at this stage, writers put together a proposal for their memoir. Mm-hmm. It's, here's 20,000 words of my memoir and a detailed synopsis of what else I'm going to talk about and all the places my essays have been published. Usually the whole memoir isn't written. So this was a delightful surprise.
I wonder, I don't know. You could speak to how easy it is to sell or hard it is to sell something that's not finished when it is just a traditional memoir. Because what I had read, excuse me, in my research was that you should query memoir like a novel, and the whole thing should be done. And so I didn't didn't even start querying until the whole thing was done. Although, my query process lasted about a year and a half, with some breaks here and there. And I continued revising. I continued getting feedback from agents. And, Allison and I are not like MFA classmates or anything. We're not like people who come from the same hometown, although we're both from Appalachia. Which is to say, I had some of my best friends referred me to their agents, and that went nowhere. So it's definitely not about the relationships you have. It does come down to the work. But so many of those referrals led to rejections with specific reasons. Some of them I agreed with, some of them I didn't, but it all helped me understand why the book was not being taken on. And, a year and a half later, give or take, the version that you ended up with, Eric, was obviously the best version. So, I mean, it's like somebody who's been through 5 marriages and finally they learn more about themselves. And so the 6th marriage works because they actually let themselves be changed by the first 5 failed marriages. And that's kind of where I was with the memoir, is it kept evolving. And you get some rejections. You're like, that's not the book I want to write. I'm not going to listen to that. And I had one agent. This is the weirdest thing. I've become friends with M. Leona Godin, who wrote an amazing book that came out a couple months ago called Their Plant Eyes, A Personal and Cultural History of Blindness. It came out from Pantheon, and it has bits of memoir around a cultural analysis of how we perceive the blind, all the way back to Homer, the Bible, pop culture, but it's just every aspect of living. It's an amazing book. I could never have written it. But one of the agents who passed on my memoir said, I feel like this should be sort of a cultural history of blindness. And I was like, yeah, I would love to read that book. I'm glad I have now. And the funniest thing is when I talked to Leona, preparing for one of our conversations for her book tour, she said, yeah, one of the agents who passed on my, or maybe, I think, it was an editor who passed on her book, said, yeah, I wish this were just a straightforward memoir and not a cultural history of blindness. So it's all so subjective sometimes.
So interesting. And I feel like it's both an agent and an editor's job to get you to tell the best version of your story, right? That's what we're here for. We're not there to radically change what it is you want to say, or radically change what your book is meant to be. So if an agent comes at you with feedback that says they're not interested in what your story is, then you're well in your rights to say no.
Yeah. And your first email to me after you got back to me after reading the manuscript, and by then I had received so many rejections that as soon as I got an email response from an agent, I just braced myself, and it's you swallow that lump in your throat and you're like, oh well, at least they didn't ghost me. So I was reading and I was like, wow, compliment, scroll down, compliment. I was like, where's the no here? And but what I found was, here are some ideas I have. Here are some things that I think would make the book work better. How do these sound to you? Do you want to talk about this? And I was like, oh wow. And they were the kind of ideas that I think the best ideas, or the kind of ideas that let you know whether or not you're with the right person, whether it's an editor or an agent or even just a beta reader for your work, are when those ideas sort of echo either misgivings you had and didn't know how to articulate, or sort of echoed in some way feedback that another of your readers had given you. And so all your thoughts, which we don't have to go into, but the things that we worked on between when we signed and when we went out with the manuscript were right in line with what I wanted the book to be, and some of them changed the shape of the book, but that was it was a very good thing. I've been around long enough and experienced enough failure that I understand when changing the shape is something somebody else wants and something that I know will make the project closer to what it needs to be. And that was the feedback that you sent me in that first read.
Yeah, and then I feel like, oh geez, I mean, when we got the edits back to me and we went on submission, it was fast, right? Like, I feel like we had an offer in within like 3 weeks. Like it maybe.
Yeah, it was, and it was the longest 3 weeks because we went out right at the beginning of the pandemic, shutting things down, and so I was double fisting my anxiety. I mean, being out on submission is as high stress as it gets, but then you're like, is the world gonna end? Let's worry about that too, I guess. And as it was a very, but I mean, ultimately, I mean, compared to most submission periods from friends that I know, yeah, it was very fast, and it was the illusion of slowness that was caused by the pandemic. And I have other friends who were out for many months in the pandemic. We got very fortunate that we landed with folks who were not, or their reading habits were not affected by, because we've all had our inboxes back up at some point.
Yeah.
Over the last year and a half, especially, or 2 years, or God, however long it's been.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. And I think the speed at which your book got acquired and the speed at which I read the book and immediately knew I had to work on it, like, really speaks to what you've done with this book, Like, whenever people ask me, like, oh, what makes a good memoir? Like, why should I write a memoir? What about my life could be a memoir? Like, I always ask people, I'm like, okay, well, what will your story teach somebody about themselves, right? Like, that's what good memoir does. You read about someone else's life and it illuminates something about you that maybe you didn't know. It teaches something about yourself. All of my favorite memoir does that, like all of it. And I really feel like that's what your memoir does, like it in some ways makes me think of things I take for granted, not just something like eyesight or senses, but people, like something that you a lot in the book is talk about relationships and being honest and what honesty ends up getting you, in the end.
Yeah.
Man, like I remember just like reading the book and like thinking about, am I being honest with all the people in my life? Like, are there ways I could be more open? And I really hope that people pick up this book and also feel that similar experience where they think deeply about themselves and who they are. And I just think that's the magnificent thing that your book does. People are going to read it, they're going to learn about themselves, and I don't know. I think you're going to change a bunch of people, and that's what great memoir does. So, and I think that's why it all happened so fast. It bums me out that other people didn't see it. Selfishly, I'm glad that I'm the one that got to work on it.
Yeah, it kind of makes you look like a genius, which in so many ways you are. and I love that you put it that way. I honestly, as simple as that sounds, that a good memoir makes you, sort of shines a mirror on yourself, or at least indirectly. It's something that I didn't really realize I was doing consciously. And in fact, the parts of the memoir where I felt we had an excerpt go up at Shondaland this week, and in that excerpt was a lot of time where I was by myself in really the most isolated couple of years of my life. Some days not leaving the apartment, or when I did leave the apartment, I would never interact with people. I was in this grad school program. I didn't really talk to the people in class. I had no friends who lived in the city, so I was just racking up long distance charges back when that was a thing. And this little 13-inch TV, and I thought, when I was writing this, who's gonna care? This feels a little too specific And one of the things you realize, and which I teach my workshop students, especially the adult students, get it really fast, because creative nonfiction is something that I think comes more easily once you cross 30 or 40 years old. But because you have that sense of nostalgia and looking at yourself from the outside in, that if you're lucky comes with age. But I thought, is this too specific? I'm by myself in so many pages here, but the voice felt really good, and I love those sections that were in the second person when I felt most unmoored from a sense of self. And I say all that to say that two of my readers, or later readers of the book, have told me that section really resonated with times in their life, times when they were dealing with addiction or mental illness. And I was like, well, that's not blindness, but it's the same emotions, that sense of isolation when you feel so disconnected from the rest of the world. And that was a revelation to me, that these feelings, even the situation is creating a totally different experience, but the emotions are very universal.
Yeah, and I think it's something, for those of you who are listening, when you're kicking around that memoir, that essay collection, like, what is it that you're going to teach other people? I think it's something that, it's weird. It's one of those things that I feel like doesn't happen purposefully, right? Like you don't sit there and say like, oh, my experience is going to teach so and so about X and Y. But like through revising and through touching it up and through working on it with your friends and your critique partners, I think that's when you can get it there, to do that thing.
Yeah.
Like even when I write my own YA novels, right? Like a lot of the times I'm not sitting there like, oh, this is the powerful message I want to say. Like I just have a funny story that I want to tell, and then it ends up happening that way, kind of organically. Let me see. So now we have this book out in the world, right? You're hopefully teaching people. You're hopefully changing people there. I really think you're going to. What was the most surprising part of this process when it came to this book coming together?
Oh boy. There's probably a number of things that I can say, but the one that might be the most entertaining, and it's freshest on my mind because it's just a week old, is I finally got to listen to the audiobook last week.
You got to tell the story, yes.
Yeah, and this is, I wrote about this in a piece for LitHub today about why I didn't want to narrate my own audiobook, even though I did try out, and it's not sour grapes. I didn't deserve to narrate it, but I was so relieved rather than disappointed, because I've only read audiobooks or text to speech or I've read with my ears exclusively since age 16. And so it was very important to me that this be, as I said in the piece I wrote for LitHub today, I'm getting the questionnaire from Norton, which is a standard production questionnaire. And I'm like, I don't really have opinions about fonts and binding color. And and I was like, number one, I totally trust W.W. Norton's production team to do what is best for the book. You do not want somebody who has not visually read a book since 1993 to make any of these decisions. You guys, I trust you. But then I kept thinking, if this were about the audiobook, I probably would have a preference, whatever the equivalent of binding color is for a voice or audiobook production. I would totally have, because I write about audiobooks and I've read them for 28 years. And so when I did not get the role of myself in the audiobook, I just, take a chance. I was like, let's at least say who our ideal narrator is. And so I wrote back to Dreamscape. I was like, I'm looking forward to whoever you give me to pick from. Somebody that I think would be really good, and I don't know that we could even reach out to him or what his availability would be, but just in terms of what kind of narrator he is, this would be somebody that I think would be amazing because of his ability to do the humor and the timing and just also the tender and contemplative moments. And it was Curtis Armstrong, which, if you've never heard him read an audiobook, I think he's only done a few. but I heard him do Wild and Crazy Guys, how the comedy mavericks of the 1980s changed Hollywood forever, which came out 2 years ago. And it's all about Steve Martin, Eddie Murphy, and Chevy Chase, and John Candy, and that whole cohort. And not only was it just brilliantly narrated, just finding the subtlety and the necessary weight of every sentence, but the humor and the timing and the emotion of so many of those stories. Excuse me, and those of you who don't know Curtis Armstrong, people my age know him best as Booger from Revenge of the Nerds, from Risky Business, and Better Off Dead, One Crazy Summer. All my hipper friends know him from Supernatural as the Metatron.
Metatron!
And he's done so much voiceover work too. And I've read his, after reading his work on Wild and Crazy Guys, I read his own memoir called Revenge of the Nerd, which I loved, and his narration was equally thoughtful on that. So just, what the hell? I just threw that in there. Just, if nothing else, I knew I would regret not saying something when the time came. And so a few weeks later, I get an email, Norton's subsidiary rights, because the audio rights are done from Dreamscape, and so we're communicating through Norton. And this came on a Friday, and boy, was it a good Friday. The message was, we were able to get Curtis. And I was, oh my Lord, you're kidding me. Oh no, wow. And then of course, like any writer, I kept waiting for the next 4 months for this news to be taken away. As a catastrophic thinker, because I didn't hear updates for a while, but it's so hard to schedule like celebrity narrators and the studio, and audiobook production is notoriously way, way, way behind print production. But anyway, I said all of that to say that last week I finally got to hear his audiobook, him reading the audiobook, and it is everything I never thought would be possible. It is everything I hoped it would be. It's funny. There's actually a whole lot more emotion than I was expecting. He really, really delivered emotion in so many of these moments. And it kind of, I stayed up all night reading this to the detriment of the next day. But it was almost the first time, because I've been reading these pages for months and years, and not unlike any writer who's read a manuscript over and over and over again, after a while, it becomes mechanical. And I'm also got my screen reader voice, my digital voice, so I have to put that emotion into it using my imagination anyway. And so I'm finally detached from this. I know there's no more revisions. I'm not reading for the purpose of editing this. I'm just reading for pure pleasure. I'm listening to Curtis Armstrong read my words, and I'm feeling emotions that are coming through that maybe a stranger would feel. Although it's much, much more than that, because it's almost like I'm watching myself on screen. It's I'm sure I was just on the Pop Literacy podcast today, and we're talking about the pop culture in the book, and we were talking about the audiobook and Curtis Armstrong, and I said, this is probably the closest I'll come to seeing myself at like a movie premiere and my life on screen. Just hearing a professional actor whose movies I grew up with, and I'm hearing his voice throughout, and I know who it is. But like any audiobook narrator who's doing a great job, after a while, the voice becomes the story and the words, and you lose track of the fact that you're listening to somebody. In the same way that you lose track of visually, you lose track of a font and ink and paper, and you're eventually absorbed into the story. I think storytelling works in audio in very much the same way it works in print. You're trying to lose yourself. And I lost myself in my own life, and yeah, some tears came. Some of them were because he was just so good, but some of them were like, oh, this is kind of uncomfortable. This is exactly like being there again. And there's some parts of the book that I'm glad I don't have to relive, but I was definitely reliving some of those emotions more vividly than I had in years.
You know, you said something really interesting a little while back there when you were talking about like trusting Norton. And you're talking about trusting your publisher when it came to like the binding and the art and things like that.
Yeah.
Because so much of the publishing process is this process of like letting go of something, right?
Yeah.
Like it's saying like, okay, well, this book isn't really mine anymore. You know, this is the publishers, this belongs to the readers now. You know, it is always gonna be the writers in the way that, you know, you keep getting paid for it, you know, and it's still out there and you're
Yeah.
still proud of it, talking about it. But it's out of your hands, right? Like, do you feel like that process differs from when you had your first novel come out versus your memoir, which is you know, like is it weird?
Yeah.
Like this piece of me isn't mine anymore. Like I'm curious about the feeling there, you know?
I'm not sure I've totally processed that yet. But it's such a difference because Academy Gothic got published because I won a contest, a university press contest. And, you know, for what it was, the experience was totally positive. I loved the editor that I worked with at Southeast Missouri State. It was a collaborative experience. But, you know, there are definitely fewer choices. There were no production choices offered to me. Although my wife Lori, who's a graphic designer, my publisher had seen some of her work, and she ended up doing the cover for Academy Gothic and getting paid for it. So it was that was a cool keep it in the family aspect of that book. But that was, I think the biggest difference was definitely less so the fiction versus nonfiction. Would make that more of an what makes it more of an apples oranges is probably the size of the press versus Norton. And that's what makes it hard for me to process. But I will say, just to sort of take that question to a similar place, I had no qualms about going to Goodreads or looking up Amazon reviews of my novel. And I was like, oh, you know, they didn't like mysteries. They didn't like my story. They didn't like my characters. So be it. They, you know, and so many of those reviews are like, I thought this was going to be a ghost story, and there were no ghosts in it. 1 star. And I have no desire and no plans to go to Goodreads or check out, you know, random comments. I'm at the stage now where Googling my name and book title is starting to get a little scary. Mm-hmm. You know, I've been doing that for months just to keep track of, oh, this is a cool thing I didn't know this was, oh, this bookstore plans to have it. And now I'm like, I think I can let go now. The book is out there, because there are structural choices I make in the book. Certainly there are narrative choices I make in the book. If you don't like the 3 chapters that are in second person point of view, I made those choices very deliberately, but if you know, that's not somebody's cup of tea, so be it. But if you can't empathize with the choices I made, and I'm not putting myself on the page as a flawless individual. I'm putting myself on the page as an extremely flawed individual. I am holding myself up with that, what Mary Carr calls the looking back voice, and saying, like older Fred Savage in the Wonder Years saying, here's where I'm going to do something really stupid. I'm already judging myself. I've already worked toward that sense of forgiving my younger flawed self. I don't think I want to experience judgment on a personal level, you know. Yeah. So that's, if I have trepidation about putting the memoir out there, that's where it comes from.
No, that makes sense. That makes total sense.
Yeah.
Let's see. So we talked about the publishing process. We talked about what makes a good memoir. Talked about your surprises. What else? What else has been part of this big journey here? What's the reception been like? Yeah, because when you write memoir, you're writing about other people too, right? It's not just
Yeah, in my memoir and personal essay classes that I teach for writing workshops, like maybe 4 or 5 times a year, I have it broken into 8 units, 8 weeks, and each week has a different topic or theme. And I think week 3 or 4 is writing about other people. And if you're writing a memoir, that is one of the landmines. And my mom is probably watching this. I think she said she was, but I got a phone call from my mom right before we went on, and she was making it into chapter, I guess, 3. And I won't embarrass her by, if you want to see what my mom did not want me to reveal. And she said this laughingly, but at her age and at my age, she's like, I hope my dad doesn't know about this that you revealed that I did when I was a teenager. I told you that in confidence years ago. And I'm like, your dad is 90. I think he's all right. I think he'll understand what you did as a teenager. And so, obviously I have a great relationship with my mom. Are there other people that I'm trepidatious about? Not really, because anybody who might not like how they're portrayed, first of all, I stand by how they're portrayed, and I hope that this is one of the things that you and I worked with, and what I loved about your early feedback is there were a couple of sections where we were evening out the portrayal of a couple of people, and very rightly so. And I think what came through in the finished book is much fairer in a couple of spots.
Which is hard for me personally, because like I'm a Scorpio, so I like
Yeah.
someone tells me they're gonna remember it forever. But I have to think about other people. So
yeah, and I think that's something, I'm it's so much easier when you're a reader to spot when somebody is portraying somebody vis-a-vis themselves, and how they're assigning blame or not assigning blame. And when you're the author, I mean, you strive for that objectivity with memoir. You have to get there, but it takes a village sometimes of other readers to help get you there and say, this page, this paragraph, let's maybe cut that, or this description, let's maybe rephrase that, or do we really need this scene? But I mean, there's plenty of people that I don't have. If your name is changed in the book, I probably don't have a relationship with you anymore. And it's not because I, severed that relationship, but the inertia of, not the inertia, the momentum of life and relationships leads you away from people. And told one of my closest friends on Facebook a few days ago, I was like, and you're in the book, but don't worry, you get to keep your name, so it's all good. And it's yeah, I mean, I mean, I don't want anybody to come away feeling like, and I don't think that's not the kind of memoir I like to read, where it's a hit job. People have done bad things, and I hope one of the people who is portrayed most fairly is myself, and I hope that my decisions are seen as flawed, the way that I behaved with myself, with other people in various times, and that's, I think, the goal. I tell my undergrads when I teach creative nonfiction, and I think it's so useful for undergrads to take creative nonfiction, even if it doesn't come naturally at that age, because it just, I think it leads you to so many epiphanies about how to view yourself in other genres, how you build character, how you use parts of your life in creating fiction. But anyway, it's so hard sometimes for 18 to 22-year-olds to think like a 40-year-old. And I'm like, what are you guys nostalgic for? And they're like, what's nostalgia? Like, what foods did you eat as a child? And you're like, I'm eating them now. So there is no, there's no distance. So what often makes them click, what clicks into place for so many of my undergrads is when I tell them think of creative nonfiction or the personal essay as a selfie in which you frequently look bad. And that, for some reason, really makes sense for lots of them. As you know, when you're taking down those Zoom filters, and I don't know how to set my Zoom filters, so I look like however I look. But it's you know, you're taking away the things that make you look good, and you're just trying to tell the straightest head-on portrayal of whatever it is.
A memoir is a selfie that makes you look bad. Like,
Or a selfie where you aren't afraid of looking bad, or a selfie where, quite frankly, you often do look bad.
yeah, I love that. I'm gonna remember that for Twitter later. That's that was really good. And, you know, and you said some interesting little keywords there while you were talking about you know, the essays that you've published and teaching. I just want to circle back to the getting published experience. Because, you know, when I think about your query letter, and I think about, you know, I remember when I was looking you up, you had all this stuff in your background where you had, you know, published all these essays. You'd written that really wonderful "Do audiobooks count as reading?"
Yeah.
And like, it's one of the things I look for the most as an agent when it comes to memoir, when it comes to essay collections, is that, like, has the person established themselves as an expert in some way, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And usually when I talk about that, when I'm talking about memoir, people, oh, well, I am the expert. I'm talking about me, right? Like, it's me. How am I not the expert of myself? But there is a way to be an expert when it comes to something about you, because usually a memoir is about something very specific, you know, and like with you, it's about blindness and your journey there. And when someone looks you up, you have all these pieces about that dig into that very personal specific thing. You know, I worked with another writer named Melody Schreiber on a
I love her.
Yeah, so she has an essay collection out called What We Didn't Expect, and it's this anthology of essays about premature birth and what it's like to have a preemie baby. And Melody has written everywhere about that. Beautiful essay on Catapult, a gorgeous piece, Washington Post. And it's just so important when you're writing memoir and you're writing essay collections to figure out what that thing is you're trying to say with your collection and with your memoir, and try to write to it in, you know, out there in other places that aren't just inside your book.
That's something. Something you were, and Eric's got a really great point by point analysis of my query letter, but tons of other successful query letters of clients on his website. And you can say what that is in a second, but the one of the things I noticed you were talking about, which is something that I think is misunderstood, and you can speak to this far more intelligently than me, but platform. So many people talk about platform with nonfiction, but with memoir, I want to say platform is just establishing the credibility of yourself as a writer, writing about the kinds of things that your memoir is about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. People hear platform and they get so scared and they're like, oh my God, I don't have 1 million Twitter followers.
Yeah.
You know, no one's going to want my book. And like, I hope everyone who's listening that's worried about that, I hope we can dispel that for you, because social media doesn't matter. Like, it's nice to have it. But if you don't have a big old following on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all that stuff, you could still sell nonfiction as long as you're out there publishing and being an expert in that space. Someone like me is never going to care if you're on Twitter. I have a huge Twitter following, and I'm not a best-selling author because I have a big Twitter following.
I think the first person I saw say this many years ago was Chuck Wendig, who's always got pithy writing tips and advice. He's like, your Twitter followers are not book sales. Which isn't to say that you aren't making friends on Twitter. I am so lucky and blessed with the number of people I've connected with who have genuinely formed a bond with me, and vice versa. But you know, I have 7,000, almost 7,000 Twitter followers. I don't think I've sold 7,000 copies yet.
Yeah, so don't stress about that part of the platform, everyone. Please, because what drove me to James was a great story first, and then the way he established himself second, really. Yeah. Yeah. Wow, we've been talking for a while. We have like
Yeah,
what?
it's looking like it's maybe time that we should pivot toward a Q&A.
Yes. 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 Let's answer some questions.
Yeah,
Are they just popping in the chat? Is that how it's working?
I think so. I don't know if Blake's going to step in and read them, but you can probably read them.
Well, I've gotten some ones sent to me privately, so maybe I'll read those, and then the ones
Okay.
that are in the chat you guys can tackle. But the first one that came in is from Jessica. So you kind of touched on this, JT, with like the difference in publishing your novel versus going with W.W. Norton, but I think the answer will be instructive. What made James choose to go with a new agent for the memoir versus using the same agent he had when he published his novel?
Oh.
Yeah, the short answer is I did not have an agent for the novel. I queried 100 agents for my novel, Academy Gothic, and the mystery agents said it was too funny and satirical, and the literary fiction agents said it felt too much like a mystery. And so I sort of let it sit for another year after feeling like it was done. And after a year, I thought, I still like this. I don't know that there's anybody else to query, but let's look at some book contests. And so I sent it off to maybe 5 or 10 book contests or open reading periods. And I was lucky to win a book contest, and that's how that got published. So there was an agent for a previous novel right after graduate school, a very kind, very old school guy right about in the memoir, and nothing but love for the chance that he took on me. But we only worked together for about a year on this ill-fated professional wrestling novel that I will never go back to.
Okay, great. Awesome. So another question came in to me from Yvette. This question is for Eric. And you kind of already touched a little bit on this, Eric, and when you and James were just talking, but when you examine query letters, how much do the writing credits matter in your decision-making about taking on a text? And generally, do you or agents want to see portions of the book published elsewhere before you pick up the book? And does it matter where the pieces of the work were previously published?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I don't really care where they've been published as long as it's something that's somewhat recognizable, right? Like if it's just like a random blog spot that I've never heard of, then maybe that's not going to mean anything. But if it's a literary journal, even a small journal that's maybe run by an author or run by a small college, like that's going to catch my eye. That's going to mean something. Just make sure it's. I don't want to say that it's run by no one, because that sounds mean, But I just don't want you publishing your essays with some website that's on like a GeoCities page, Like you make sure that you're sending your work to places that are going to boost you up and push you outside of the bubble that you're in as a writer, right? That's why you publish essays and articles, to get out of that bubble. So just make sure you're doing that when you're pitching your stuff around. The writing credits, as far as big interest, as far as moving me one way or the other, as long as there's a few, I'm going to be interested. It doesn't have to be like a huge laundry list of places. I recently signed someone who had I think 6 credits in terms of like mastheads to their name, and that was enough. I was like, all right, let's get to work. This looks great. And then I signed somebody who had none, but they're a doctor, and that's kind of what I needed for the kind of book that we're working on. It depends on what the project is, really. It's always going to vary a little bit.
Okay, well, this is a question from Eileen, and I think both of you could probably answer this from both sides of the equation. But Eileen says, totally agree that a great memoir teaches and shares life lessons that leaves the reader changed. But JT, what made you think and believe that you had lessons that had to be shared, that compelled you to keep pressing?
That's a tough question, because I'm not sure, like Eric was saying, I'm not sure this was something that I was conscious of during the writing of the book. the thing that I was certain of while writing the book is that I had a story and that I had a voice that I liked spending time with. Like the voice from the novel, which was a sort of hard-boiled, sardonic Philip Marlowe voice. I sort of took parts of that humor and I realized I can take that same self-deprecating humor and apply that to myself. And suddenly now I'm viewing myself from the outside in, and this lifelong charade of passing for sighted not only has comic potential, but it's going to allow me, in the parts that are going to be most emotionally raw, it's going to allow me to approach that because I have this buffer of the voice between me and the most sensitive emotions. And eventually I start, as the story comes into shape and I'm realizing, I think this is something that we all do. Well, I think we all hide parts of ourselves at various points of our lives, depending on who we're with at the time. And I think our relationships are always going to suffer when we're hiding parts of ourselves. And, think about the relationships that have been most successful. It's usually because we're most open with those people, showing them all the parts of ourselves that maybe we were once ashamed of. And it's once I started diving into those kinds of themes, I was like, okay, I've got something here that's bigger than just a navel-gazing story of my experiences. I do think there's something that other people will find useful.
Okay, our next question that came in, thank you, JT, from Jessica. I think this is interesting because I know, JT, you have a new novel. I'm not sure what the status of that is, but the question from Jessica is for Eric. As an agent, how do you approach working with fiction writers differently from working with writers of memoir?
Ooh, that is a really good question. I guess with fiction, a lot of fiction is, what is it that you're trying to say with this novel, right? When it comes to a novel, I feel like the edits are maybe a lot more straightforward than it is with a memoir. With like memoir, it's with memoir, it's a lot of, I don't think you can say this. Let's write something completely new here.
Yeah.
Opposed with a novel where I'm like, oh, let's adjust this character's journey, or let's adjust this little bit here. I feel like the slicing and dicing is a lot different comparatively. And there's this odd thing that happens as an agent when you're trying to sell a project, and that's, as an agent, I edit to sell things, right? So like I don't really get to do like deep developmental edits with people as much as I might like to anymore. So with fiction, it's very little. It's, oh, let's adjust this character arc. Oh, let's maybe fix up this chapter. With memoir, it's, oh, maybe let's add another essay here that's about something else. And that tends to be it. Yeah, it's it's funny because James is like this very rare case where he gave me a whole book. When I'm working with most memoirists and other nonfiction projects, it's the proposal where I'm writing 20,000 words about why this editor needs to buy this book, and the author is writing like 10,000 words of the project. So it's, I don't know. In a lot of ways, writing nonfiction, I write a lot more than they have to in the fiction space. I don't know. I come from a marketing background in publishing before I was an agent, and I just tend to like that a lot. So yeah, it is different.
Thank you for that answer, Eric. Hey, JT, this is a question from Michelle. She says, and you touched a little bit this about when your mom read a section, chapter 3, but she says, I'm queer, and Michelle says, I'm queer and afraid of parents reading about my experiences sometimes since they're not really accepting. How does one deal with that?
That's, yeah, you got an hour. This is a whole conversation. And Eric might have a lot more to say about this because he is so good about taking on projects from a really wide variety of voices, and I'm certain that he has authors maybe who have confronted this, but I will just say from my own experience, and that's really all I can speak to, is, and I, I tell my students this too, you have to be first and foremost faithful to the work, but you also have to understand that if there are people who are going to have reactions to what you're putting on the page, you have two choices: make sure they never ever see it, or understand that there are going to be effects to that relationship. And part of the answer to that question is beyond my purview, is probably family therapist territory. And that's what makes it such a complicated, but it's such a great question, Michelle. But Eric, do you have any thoughts on that?
That's a great question.
Let me interject real quick, Eric, because Michelle has a follow-up that just says, with query letters, how personal do you mind writers being with you? For example, referring to details from your own life that might explain your potential interest in their work.
Ooh, it's really up to you. I'm not a believer in writers feeling like they have to disclose like every personal thing about their life in order to, publish their work. Like I know there's this like unfortunate, I don't know, trend in publishing where writers feel like they have to exploit everything that's marginalized about themselves in order to sell their projects, and I don't believe in that. If you're not comfortable talking about something, you shouldn't have to put it out there in paper to prove why you should be able to write this certain thing. So only talk about what you're comfortable with. Don't feel like you have to deeply mine your life in order to sell your work, because that's, the work should speak for itself, and you shouldn't have to do that. And that comes from me as someone who's a person of color who just gets very upset about that sort of thing. And when it comes to worrying about people reading the work, I guess I'm in JT's boat where I wish I had a good answer for that, because I kind of don't. You go into it knowing there's the possibility of someone reading it and being affected. And I wish I could speak to it in my own writing, but my parents don't read my books, so it's the kind of thing where I really wouldn't know how to speak to it personally.
Well, it looks like we have just one more question. It looks like from Rodrigo. If you have, anything else, be sure to put that in the chat. But from Rodrigo, we have James. When writing your book, did you have an outline and/or specific structure, or were you more of a pantser, seat of your pants kind of writer, and just developing the book as you wrote? And he said, Rodrigo says, I find my best work comes kind of out of nowhere, but consistently stalling a bit.
It's a great question, and it's probably something that I would answer differently with a novel versus a memoir, but I'll take it from the memoir since that's why we're here. I would say, because the structure of Blind Man's Bluff had a finite number of years, or it had a finite period of time that I was covering, I sort of had a beginning, middle, and end in mind. But how I got from the beginning to the end changed pretty drastically over the course of the writing. This thing was way out of order. The version that eventually Eric saw, and that structurally is fairly close to the one that's in bookstores, is fairly chronological, aside from a prologue that is sort of a flash forward. But I had this thing way jumbled up, and I thought, it was almost like if you've ever seen the old show Damages or West Wing, how everything was like flashback, flash forward, how'd this get here? And just shooting my narrative in the foot when I had a pretty straightforward, compelling narrative that I didn't trust. And so I was trying to get fancy with the structure. And I also thought, oh, maybe this is a a neat metaphor for the fact that I use the rim of my peripheral vision. So I'm like sort of circling the center of the story. And yeah, as one agent who saw that version said, this feels more like an essay collection. And she did not mean that as a compliment. She meant that as a, I'm breaking up with you as of this pass. And but it was, did I have an outline? No, but I definitely thought of each chapter as a unit, and thinking that an easier way to find an agent or editor or publisher eventually for the book would be to have parts of it published. At least I think half to 2/3 of the book I sort of organized as essays that could potentially stand alone. And I think about half the pieces did find homes, or maybe a third to a half. And so I sort of viewed them as essays, so units of the story. And so that's probably a type of an outline, I guess.
Well, it looks like that was our last question. It looks like we're at the top of the hour, and I want to thank everybody for being here. Oh, we've got one last question. Here we go. Eric, if there is one common thing new writers are guilty of doing in query letters that is an instant turnoff, what might you say it is?
Talking down about other books. I see that a lot in query letters, where someone will say like, oh, I've written this novel. It's a little bit like these books, but my book is way better than this. And it's one of those things that whenever I tell people, everyone laughs, but man, people do it all the time. And I'm also a writer. Sometimes I know those people, and it's not a good look. So yeah, don't do that. Don't do that.
That's good advice. I'm just putting, a link to Eric's website in the chat. I'm putting a link to JT's website in the chat. And I don't know, there was a question. I'm not sure if this was, how do I learn about upcoming events? David, if you're referring to writingworkshops.com, you can go to writingworkshops.com, which is us. And if you're referring to upcoming events with JT or Eric with the release of future books or anthologies, I've got their websites there in the chat. But thank you all for being here on a Tuesday night. We're so happy that JT and Eric came together to have this discussion. JT, congratulations.
Thank you.
On memoir today. And Eric, thank you for facilitating this conversation and kind of sharing a lot of inside scoop.
No problem. My pleasure. I hope everyone has a good.
Thank you, everybody, for being here, and Blake for hosting us, and Eric, I can't thank you enough for spending publication night with me. And this is the good, relaxing, so much more relaxing than getting dressed up and going out to a bookstore and sweating and stumbling. And
Anytime.
Everybody rest well.
All right, everybody. Well, thank you for being here tonight. You all be safe. Happy reading, happy writing, and we'll see you at another event. Thank you all. Thanks, JT. Thanks, Eric.
Thanks, Blake. Bye.